Okay, so welcome everybody and welcome to those online. And we're going to be talking again about ocean sediments. So I know that doesn't probably excite a lot of thrilling feelings in you about sediments looking out upon your faces. But I think you'll find it a little bit more interesting. You'll find them maybe more interesting than you think they are. So I'll just say that. But yeah, we're going to do ocean sediments for this whole week. So first of all, we want to know what on earth is sediment. Let me get my notes out here. Okay, so we're on number 10, right? Okay. So what on earth is sediment? So it can consist of a few things, right? So it can actually be made out of broken pieces of rocks and minerals. Okay, that's one thing it can be. Well, I guess number one is just what is sediment, right? So sediment is just loose, unconsolidated material, right? And it can be a lot of different stuff, so we're going to see what it can, but it's loose and unconsolidated. So it's just like, like this lady's got this sand grains going through her fingers. Okay, so for example, that's the bedrock, right? That's like the actual rock of the crust. Okay, that's not sediment because it's still attached to the earth, right? The sediment is the stuff at the base. You see how at the base of this cliff, that's the sediment. Okay, and if you zoom in with this, of course, you can see with your naked eye, right? But if you were to zoom in, to sand or silt or something, you could see it's made of a bunch of little rocks. Okay. So it can consist, sediment can be a lot of different stuff, but one kind is just little pieces of rocks and minerals, okay? And if you look closely, you can even, some of this stuff, this is like a close-up of sand. Some of this stuff, a lot of it is actually just like quartz. And there's actually like a little piece of rose quartz in here, and there's all sorts of different minerals in here. But so that's the one thing that it can consist of. Now, what else can it be? And another thing, this is something a lot of people don't think of, it can also consist of the shells of marine organisms. Okay, it can consist of the shells of marine organisms. So here, if you look at that, there's all the different, has anyone ever been to a beach that looks like this? And actually, there's some parts of the island that kind of look like that. Maybe not as big pieces of shells, but like just little broken pieces of shell. Like I've gone to the island, parts of the island where it's just like all crushed shell. Has anyone ever seen that before? So, no one's ever noticed that? I know that there are some places around the bay where it's just like oyster shells. Maybe, or has anyone ever gone to Indian Point? No, you've ever been to Indian Point on the other side of the bay? No. You have? Have you seen these? There's some parts of those there's just oyster shells. The sand is like just made of oyster shells. So hopefully you've seen that before. But anyway, shells can be a major source of sediment as well. So here, this is actually from Corpus Christi. So this is like a sand, maybe you wouldn't call it a sand spit, but it's a spit, right? And it's just oyster shells. See, that's a picture just from locally, right? So that's one kind of, and actually, sorry I keep turning the lights on and off, but I assume you can kind of see these things better, right, with the lights off. So I just wanted to show you this. I'm going to turn it off again, sorry. But if you take a look at this, I want to point this out. This is a close-up of some sand. And at first glance, it would just look like normal sand to you, right? But if you actually zoom in with a microscope, and I brought our microscope here so you can actually do this, it's actually a bunch of little pieces of coral and shells and all sorts of living organs. Do you see this, what I'm talking about? Like, look at, that's like a little piece of coral. That's coral, like all that's coral, shells. That's actually a little sponge, right? A little sponge organism. We'll talk more about sponges later. But these are all pieces of living organisms. See, so but if you look at it, it's so fine-grained, you would just think it's sand, right? But it's actually not rock. It's made out of little shells, little tiny shells. So this is something we're going to see over and over and over again in this class, is that so much of this sediment consists of the little tiny microscopic shells of living organisms that are in the water. Okay? And there's lots and lots and lots and lots of living organisms in every little drop of seawater. Okay, so, and you know what? And a lot of them make shells. So we're going to see all this stuff as we move through the class. Okay. So this is a scanning electron microscope image, an SEM image of some sediment. Okay, so this is a real extreme close-up. And you can see that it's all made up out of tiny little shells. So you all see that? And it's a crazy thing because I just want to impress this upon you because I find this so crazy. These shells, do you see how a lot of them are like very intricate and some of them are very pretty? You know, like they're pretty like the normal seashells you get at the beach. And they are so small you can't see it with normal light because they're actually smaller than light waves. Isn't that nuts? It's smaller than light waves. The only way that you can see it is through a scanning electron microscope image. So they have to scan it with an electron beam to image it. But there's this beautiful shell there that you can't be seen with light. It's a nutty thing, don't you think? I just find that so strange. But and these are actually kind of ugly ones. There's some of them you'll see that are like very beautiful shells, and they're smaller than light. Okay, so another source, besides all the interesting little microorganisms creating the sediment, there's also volcanic ash. That's a little bit more rare, but it's a source. And just speaking generally, there's a lot of clay and dust that comes off of the continents too, along with volcanic ash that comes off the continents. Okay, and that ends up in the ocean too, because you can see how it goes flying up into the air, and then the wind blows it over the seas, and then it settles out over the oceans. Okay. Another source of sediment. Sorry, I got a lot of different sources of sediment. How many spaces do I give you? I only give you 4. There are a lot, though, so you'll see. I'm just kind of introducing you all these different things you probably never even thought of as sediment, right? Another source of sediment. You remember we talked about these hydrothermal vents, the black smokers and the white smokers? Well, remember that they're constantly pumping out all of this precipitated mineral grains. Consists of things like iron oxides, iron hydroxides, iron sulfides. That's what all the black is you see coming out of there. See that? Well, all that stuff is solid. It's not like a gas or a liquid or anything. It's solid, and it's going to settle out eventually. Okay. So if you look at you look at these little things. They look like pipe bombs. They're the little sediment columns. You'll notice that there's this really dirty water on top, right? Now, some of yours had settled out, like that one next to Gus has settled out pretty well. But all that is like the fine-grained material. That dirty water is all the fine-grained material that is eventually it's going to take time for it to settle out, okay? So all the really fine-grained material like this is all very fine-grained. It's going to take time for it to settle out. Whereas you notice the big hunks of stuff, the sand and the gravel, you notice how that's already at the bottom, right? It's already settled. So. Here's also some more stuff that just precipitated. These are all what we would call chemical precipitates. Chemical precipitates. So you can see this stuff is precipitated out too. This is salt from the Dead Sea. Has anyone ever heard of the Dead Sea? Right, Dead Seas. Does anybody know where it is? So it's in like the Holy Lands. It's in like Israel and that area, right? It's in Jordan. So this is all salt. It's just salt because the Dead Sea is super saturated. It has as much salt as can possibly be absorbed into the water. The water can't hold any more salt than this. So that's it. You actually see the salt precipitating out. So it's got too much salt. It's got so much salt, it has too much, it can't take anymore. So all this is just, we would classify that still as, as long as it's loose, we classify that all as mineral grains that are kind of sediment. Okay. Now I guess this stuff is consolidated. And you know what's crazy is that if you look at the oceans, you can imagine at the bottom of the ocean, how much water do you have on top of you? If you're at the bottom of average ocean, how much water do you have over you? So I'm asking how deep is the ocean on average? You got to know that number like the back of your hand. 4 kilometers, right? Yeah, if you know 4 kilometers, that's good. Okay. Is that what you're thinking? Oh, okay. So it's about 4 kilometers, right? 4,000 meters, which is, does anybody know about how many feet? About? It's about, there's about 3.28 feet per meter. So it's about maybe 12,000 to 15,000 feet deep. That's kind of how deep the oceans are. Okay, so think about this. You have all this water on top of you, right? And there's all sorts of stuff that's slowly, just like the water here, right? It's going to slowly be settling out, very, very slowly. Okay. So that one got shaken up really a lot. So that's why it's all very turbid, dirty right now. Okay. But you could see that one. Gus, could you hold that one, or Hayden hold that one up and see? See how that one is not so dirty water, and there's kind of a layer of silt at the bottom. You all see this? Okay, so you see that's the kind of dirty water that has a lot of the silt and clay, and then this is the silt and clay that's settled out, right? So as you give it some time, yours is like that too, man. So if you give it some time, it's all going to settle out, right? And you're going to have relatively clean water sitting on top. I don't know if it's clean, but it'll be relatively clean. Okay. So anyway, think about this. There's all this sediment that's going to be coming from the 4,000 meters of water that's on top of you. It's all the dead little microorganisms, all the clay, all the ash, all the silt, all the stuff, and it's going to be falling like snow on the bottom. So actually, if you go down, they take these submersibles down to the depths, it almost looks like snow is falling. You're like, well, it looks like it's snowing down there. And what it is, it's all the little pieces of sediment that are slowly drifting down. So I'll show you this. And all this stuff that's falling, it's all biological debris. It's all from life. See that? Just to kind of give you an idea of all the amount of material that's constantly falling. And it builds up, maybe like on average, it's building up like 1 millimeter to 1 centimeter per year of material. Okay. All right, so there's a lot of different, I can say, kind of classification schemes that we use for sediment. So one way that we classify sediment is by grain size. So that's one way we do it. There's another type of classification that's kind of more based on composition. Composition means what is it made out of. Okay, so I just want to get you used to this different classification schemes. So right now I'm just going to talk about how it's classified according to grain size. Okay, so sediment can be classified by number 3, grain size, and composition. Right, what it's made of. So we have 2 different schemes that we're going to use as we go through the class, okay? So sediment can be classified according to grain size. So these are just some common classification terms that we use for grain size. So clay is the finest grain material. So if you look at your sediment boxes, get that out. And you can get number 40. It's kind of gray color, and it's very fine. And it looks like powder, it looks like flour, or something like that. Okay, so you can see that is clay. It's very fine-grained material. Okay? And if you look at that, can anybody actually see the individual grains if you look at it? I mean, there's some little micro dirt clods. But, I mean, can you actually see the independent little grains? So hopefully, unless you have Superman vision, you should say no, because you shouldn't be able to see it. It's pretty small. Okay. Now the next one up is silt. And silt is a little bit. Do I have any silt? It might be number 41. That's kind of a darker color. Silt is a little bit bigger, but you still usually cannot see silt. It's still, but you might notice that it's, I think number 40, the clay, it has the consistency of like bread flour, if that makes sense. If you know, whereas I think you can see with number, what is it, 41, which is the silt, it doesn't act so much like flour. It kind of acts like a fine-grained soil or dirt or something like that. Right? Okay, now the next type is sand. And we actually split up sand in a few different ways. Like we have fine-grained sand and we have coarse-grained sand. But number 47 is sand. And I don't think you need to spend too much time looking at it because you all know what sand is like, right? I assume everybody knows what sand is like. However, you can take a look about like 46 and 47 because you have like a fine-grained sand is number 47, and then you have kind of a medium-grained sand, which is number 46. And you can maybe compare. And then we should have, I think we even have maybe a coarse-grained sand. Yeah, number 45 is like a coarse-grained sand. Okay, so that's sand. Then we have things like pebbles, which, you know, that's maybe like number 48 or 40. What is it? This one. Oh, I don't have a label on this one. What is it, 40, 43? 43 or 48. Okay, that's pebbles. Now, I can't fit it in your boxes, but, you know, there's also things like cobbles. Has anyone ever been to a beach that's made of cobbles like this? Do we have these in Texas? So we don't. I don't think there's anywhere in Texas that has beaches like this. But if you go to the Pacific coast, and we'll actually learn why this is later in the class, you will find these kinds of beaches. And I've been to beaches like this on the Pacific coast, the California coast and Pacific Northwest, where they're actually not made of sand, but made of cobbles. And it's places where you get really big waves, and those waves are able to carry the cobbles. See? Whereas here, our waves and our tides are pretty small. Good. Has anyone ever been to the Pacific coast? Liam, have you been there before? What do you think? What do you think? How do you compare the Pacific coast and Pacific beaches and the water?
It's not rough. No, there's a lot of big rocks on the beaches.
Yeah. Okay. Good. A lot of big rocks on the beaches compared to here, because here it's like a lot of like sand and mud.
It's like a dark sand.
Yeah. Yeah. That's also true. Yeah. It's darker. I've noticed that too. I don't exactly know why, but it's a different color. And then another thing is, did you actually go into the water? Did you notice the temperature difference?
It was cold.
It's cold, right? The Pacific coast is cold. And we'll learn why that is later in the class when we study currents. So anyway, that's grain size, right? So going all the way from clay to maybe pebbles, you know, cobbles, boulders, things like that. Okay, so sediment is transported by a lot of different things. So now number 4 is asking you, how do you end up with sediment in the oceans? So maybe some of this stuff is intuitive to you. How do you get sediment into the oceans? We can even probably brainstorm this one. Probably a lot of you can just figure it out. But how does sediment wind up in the ocean? Because there's a lot of it in the ocean. There's lots of sediment. Yeah, erosion. Sure, erosion off the land, right? So the continents, the mountains, and everything is being eroded. What are the things that are eroding the land and bringing the sediment into the ocean? What are some things that actually erode? The agents of erosion.
Glaciers?
Actually, you got like the most obscure one, which is, yeah, but glaciers do a lot of it. Yeah, glaciers. Do I have a picture of a glacier? I don't, yeah, oh, I have one right down there. Glaciers actually do a lot. And what are some other things that are like maybe very intuitive that you see every day?
Rivers.
Rivers, right? So rivers, yeah, floods, you say floods. So. Yeah, rivers, right? So rivers bring a lot of sediment into the oceans. Yeah. Remember, so some of you did the turbidity exercise with me, right? Some of you did that. I gotta get some more water samples so more students can participate in that. But the turbidity, when you hear about turbidity in the water, that refers to how dirty the water is, how much sediment it's carrying. Okay? So the water that's flowing into the oceans is usually pretty dirty. Has anyone ever seen well, you can kind of compare just Oso Creek. Has everyone looked at Oso Creek or any the Nueces River, right? And you can see that the water isn't perfectly crystal clear. it's carrying a lot of sediment and dust and things into the rivers. Okay. So, or for example, has anyone ever heard like the Mississippi River? It's called the Big Muddy. Has anyone ever heard that term before? Maybe not. Maybe that's too obscure. But it's called the Big Muddy because it's carrying a lot of mud and silt and stuff like that. So, okay, so we got glaciers that carry sediment to the oceans. We have rivers. What else might carry sediment into the oceans? The wind. Yeah, the wind. Do I have it? Yeah. That's kind of meant to signify the wind right there. It's kind of, I don't know. Can't really see the wind, but yeah, wind. Wind brings a lot of it too. So like, remember I talked about the volcanic ash? Here's another thing. Do you all know about the dust from the Sahara that comes sometimes in the summer, and then everybody affects people, right? Okay, how does it get over here? How does it go from the Sahara? Through winds, right? So and a lot of, you know what, that's unusual. Usually that wind is bringing it and over the ocean, and it falls out of the ocean, over the ocean, so it falls into the oceans. Okay. All right, so you can have running water. Oh, I had all this stuff up here. I noticed that. Maybe you were thinking of it creatively anyway. But yeah, so you can have running water or wind or glaciers. All that stuff can bring sediment into the oceans. And then, of course, there are what we could call in situ sources. So these are sources of the ocean, from the ocean itself. The ocean itself creates its own sediment, right? So remember there's all the biologic activity. There's the black smokers and the precipitation that's going on inside the ocean as well. So there's what we would call in situ. I could write that up on the board because that's kind of a weird word you haven't probably heard before. In situ means this. But that's just stuff that is from a source from the ocean itself. But as far as bringing sediment into the ocean from outside, it's water, rivers, right, runoff, floods, wind, glaciers, etc. Okay, now, probably when a lot of you think of glaciers, you think of like big ice cubes that just sit there, but don't think of them that way. Glaciers are like, think of a glacier as a river of ice. Part of the definition of a glacier is it has to flow. Glaciers are rivers of ice. So they're constantly flowing, moving, and bringing sediment into the river, into the ocean. Okay. So this is actually a time lapse. You can see it goes from 1987 to 2000. So over almost 15 years. And it's actually, what I'm trying to show you, do you see how the glacial ice actually looks like you can see it moving, right? That's the ice. You can see it flowing. So that's actually the ice that it just flows, just like a river, but it just flows slowly, so you don't see it, right? But with a time lapse like this, you do see it. So that's constantly bringing sediment into the ocean. And what happens is when the glaciers reach the sea, it drops, it calves off, it breaks off, it creates icebergs. Those icebergs go floating out, and then they melt, and it drops the sediment out. Okay? And you can actually you see this barrier island that's formed right here? It's a barrier island, just like we have, in Corpus, right? That's all built up from the dirty. I mean, you can actually see the sediment, right? That's building up there at the toe of the glacier. So that's how that all works. So glaciers definitely bring stuff in. So glaciers, river deltas, wind-blown sediments, all that stuff brings sediment into the oceans. Okay, so that's number 4. I think I've explained that quite a bit. Okay. Now, another thing I want to say is that sediment gets, as it gets transported, it gets moved, it usually breaks up the more it's been transported. So when it first breaks off of the rocks and mountains and the bedrock and stuff like that, it's pretty big. It's like boulders and cobbles and stuff. But as it gets think of a rock tumbler, right? As it tumbles along, it gets carried by the wind, the glaciers and the rivers and blah, 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 and the waves, and it gets brought to the beach and the waves are battering it. okay, it gets broken down into smaller and smaller pieces. So normally what you find, is that close to shore, what do you usually find when you're close to shore? What kind of sediment size if you go to the beach do you usually find close to shore at the beach? Sand, right? So you normally find sand. Now, if you go out further, if you were to travel along the bottom of the seafloor in a little submarine and keep going out further and further, you would start to find silt, because the silt gets carried out further. So you can look at your little water column here. If you want, you can shake it up. Everybody likes to shake these. So if you want, you can shake it up. And think about all of the rivers bringing sediment into the ocean. And what you see is that the sand drops out right away. And the gravel and stuff like that drops out right away. So it drops out right kind of at the mouth of the river. It drops out all the sand. But then the silt and the clay and the really fine stuff get dropped out further out to sea. Now, I want to talk a little bit now about the next question is about energy, right? Energy of deposition. Okay, think of this. I'm going to put a lot of energy into this, okay? I'm going to be shaking it like this. If I shake it like this, will the sediment ever settle out? You think it'll settle out?
Like once you stop it.
When I stop. But if I'm shaking it, will it settle? Okay, what if I shake it? You can actually do this. Shake it just like this. And you notice that even though I'm shaking it still, do you see how the sand has still managed to drop out? Okay, and the gravel. But if I shake it like this, will the silt ever drop out or the clay? It won't. You see, it'll always be muddy water. So what do I have to do to get that silt and that clay to drop out of the water column? Yeah, I have to not move it at all, right? I need to have like no energy, very low energy, right? I'm surprised that nobody wants to shake this. Usually that's the first thing. Usually people come in here and they're just, it's weird that nobody wants to, yeah. You know, it's okay, you don't have to. It's psychologically interesting. Nobody's shaking these columns. Whatever. Okay, so the energy of the environment, what is that talking about? It means how much the water's moving. How much that water is moving. If I'm shaking that thing really hard, the water's moving crazy, right? It's just a lot of velocity, a lot of turbulence. But if I stop shaking it, that's low energy, right? The water's not moving anymore. And then the silt and the clay and the fine grained stuff can drop out of the water column. So again, like number 6, I don't even need to show you any slides. Probably you can figure this out. Where in the ocean is the water just really turbulent and moving and it's got a lot of energy? Yeah, near the surface and near the land, right? At the beach, right? Because that's where all the waves are coming in and the tides are going up and down and the waves are rolling in and they're churning up the sediment. That's high energy. Some places have really big waves. We don't really have that big of waves in Corpus Christi, right? It's pretty small. But especially within the bay, they're very small. If you go out to the island, right, they get bigger because you're exposed to the whole Gulf of Mexico. But if you go out to the Pacific, the waves get even larger. Did you notice that, Liam? Did you think the waves were generally larger on the Pacific coast? So anyway, yeah, so at the beach, at the coastlines, and also near the surface. But the water moves pretty slowly or not at all in the deep oceans. Okay, so in the very deep ocean, when you're at the bottom of the ocean, you're far away from the waves and the action on the surface. That water is really hardly moving. Okay, so that's going to create two sorts of environments. One's going to be a high energy environment that we're going to call the neritic environment. It's near the coast. And it's going to create a low energy environment called a pelagic environment. Pelagic means kind of like the ocean bottom. like of the deep ocean. Okay, so near shore is high energy. We call that a neritic environment. Offshore, that's the pelagic environment, and we get lower energy. Okay, so what kind of sediment do we find? Near shore, we find sand and pebbles, and then it will grade to silt and clay, and then when you get really deep, it'll just be clay. So if you go in a submarine to the bottom of the ocean, 4,000 meters deep, you're not going to find any big boulders there. It's just going to be like mud. That's what's going to be there. Okay, so what do you think of that? High energy or low energy? It says up there. High energy, right? So what do you expect to find there? Do you expect to find clay and silt on the... Do you think if you go up to this and you start, you stick your feet in that water, do you think you're going to sink up to your knees in mud? Because all that mud and clay gets blown out to sea, further away. So what are you going to find up here close to the shore where the waves are crashing and coming up? Rocks and boulders, sand and cobbles, stuff like that. And the bigger the waves, the bigger the pieces of rock, right? Bigger the sediment. So this is what I was telling you about. This is California coast. And you can find places in California coast where you get like cobbles like that. See, there's no sand, right? It's all these cobbles. And those are usually places where there's, generally speaking, there's a lot of wave action. And you might, actually, this is kind of cool, because you might notice, if you look closely, kind of within the tidal range, you'll notice that sediment's a little bit smaller. Can you see that? So the big stuff is all further away, and the reason is that's when there's really big storms or something, and it brings the big material further upshore. And actually, I've noticed this too, just going to Corpus Christi beaches. I'll see this in some places too. You'll get these burns that have kind of larger, maybe like gravel or coarse sediment, and then as you get close to the water's edge, because it's only the storms, like the big storm surges, that bring the big cobbles of gravel and stuff like that. So anyway, so finer grained sediment gets pushed out to sea. Finer grained sediment gets pushed out to sea. So do you see how this river, I think this is a river, I don't know which one this is, but it's a river off the coast it's one of the Texas rivers. And you can see, look how muddy that river is, right? And you can see all that mud going out to sea. Almost looks like a big plume of smoke, right? So it's all getting pushed out to sea. This is Corpus Christi. You've probably seen this before, right? Has anyone ever trumped, what's the right word? Try to walk through the back bays around here, the backwater bays, and it's a lot of mud, lots and lots of mud. And the reason there's so much mud in those, for example, Oso Bay, or things like that, there's a lot of mud, is because we're protected from the waves because of the barrier islands. So we generally have kind of lower energy environments here in the bays, and that's why you can collect a lot of mud in these things, and so sometimes that happens. This happens to me a lot because I bring my two-year-olds, she's 3 now, I don't even know what I'm talking about. But she would go, when I first brought her here, we'd go exploring around Indian Point, and she'd go wandering off into the mud flats. And I didn't know anything. I was new to Texas, and I was trying to follow her, but she only weighs 30 pounds. So she was kind of walking on top of the mud flats, and then I tried to follow her, and then I ended up like that, just up to my thighs in mud. I lost my sandals, they were gone. I just swallowed by the mud. And she just ran off on top of the mud because she didn't weigh anything. So anyway, oops, it's the wrong light. Anyway, that's what it's like. So now, of course, when you go out to sea, you get away from the coastlines, things slow down, right? So the water slows down and it's nice and still and glassy, and of course on the bottom, now of course this is out in the middle of the ocean. Of course you can have storms and stuff be churning. But all the waves that happen on the surface don't affect the ocean bottom because the ocean bottom is so deep. Okay? So that makes it a very low energy environment at the ocean bottom, if that makes sense. So in the deep water, this is called the pelagic environment. You get low energy and you get finer grained material. Okay, so generally speaking, number 7, generally speaking, what kind of sediment do you find near shore in the neritic environment?
Small rock,
Yeah. Coarse sand, gravel, and cobbles, and things like that. So larger grain cells. Number 8, what is sediment like in the deep ocean? This is what the ocean bottom looks like in the deep ocean. When you go down 4,000 meters, that's what it looks like. Does it look like a lot of cobbles? And no, right? It's mud city. And a lot of it's just the bodies of little microorganisms, little tests. We call those, by the way, we call those things, the little bodies of microorganisms, we call those tests. Tests. You'll hear that word a lot. It's a big deal. The plankton is like, that was the thing, like, I don't know, this class, the thing I didn't know was like how much plankton there is in the ocean and how much, it's how important it is. It plays a huge, 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 huge role, but we just don't think of it because we don't see it, generally speaking. It's just microscopic. So you're going to see this though. I mean, for the rest of the class, it's going to be almost every class I'm going to talk about plankton because it just comes up so much. Okay, so that's sediment in the deep oceans. Now we're going to classify sediment by its source and what it's made out of. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears. That was sediment classified by grain size. Now we're going to talk about composition, what it's made of, and also where it's from. Okay, the source of the sediment. So deep sea sediment has 2 sources. Okay, there's terrigenous material, and biogenous material, biogenic. Okay, we're going to talk about those 2 things. Okay, so terrigenous sediment. Terrigenous sediment is the stuff that's eroded by the rocks and minerals on land, and it's brought to oceans by rivers, wind, and glaciers. Okay, so the stuff that is from the land, the terra, right, the continental earth, we call that terrigenous. Terra means earth, genus means like the Genesis, that's where it's from. Okay. So it's from the earth, it's from the continents, that's terrigenous. So you can have stuff being brought into the oceans by rivers. You can also have stuff being brought to the oceans by glaciers. And this is a show. This is what I was showing you. This is what I was talking about before. This is a shot off the satellite photo off the coast of the Sahara Desert. Okay, and then note you can literally see the sand being blown off and the dust being blown off of the Sahara. Do y'all see that? And then sometimes the wind patterns, whatever that happens to be, sometimes that sediment can make it all the way here in the south of the American South, right? And can affect people. Okay, so that's terrigenous sediment, right? Sediment can also be biogenous. Bio is life, right? Bio. Genus means the genesis, right? So it's the sediment that's from life in the ocean. So these are all, like I said, these are just microscopic tests of plankton. And look how much of it there is, right? You got plenty of it. And it's just amazing. I just find plankton so amazing because there's all different sorts and there's a huge, huge diversity of life and the whole ecosystem that's just totally, we don't, it's just invisible to us, but it's very, very important. You'll see throughout this class, it's like plankton, 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 plankton. I won't stop talking about plankton. Okay, so, and it doesn't have to be small either. Biogenous sediment can be like seashells like that, right? Skeletons of marine organisms, the remains of larger marine organisms, that can all count as biogenous sediment. Okay, so those, the oceans are full of life, and all that life, when it dies, what happens to it? It all sinks to the bottom, right? So this is like a microscope image of, look at the huge amount of diversity of life that's it's microscopic in the ocean water. And you can see things that are arthropods, like crustaceans. You can see things that are polychaetes, that are types of segmented worms that are related to they're in like the earthworm family, basically. They're segmented worms. But you can see things like that. You see things like krill. And then there's all sorts of different types of algae, right? And all the algae, I know this is kind of weird, a lot of the algae has little shells too. So there's all sorts of forms of life in the ocean, and a lot of them make shells. They make little tiny shells. I don't know what a little tiny organism does with a shell, but a lot of them have shells. I still haven't gotten an answer to that question. I'm not a marine biologist, from the inorganic side of things. Okay, so let's talk more in depth about plankton, because like I said, it's important. So what is plankton? So just kind of some clarity on these terms here. It's very important. It's a collection of organisms at the base of the food chain. But plankton, actually, what is it? It's any life that floats with the tide and with the currents. So if you're a planktonic organism, you're an organism that just gets kind of carried with the tides and with the currents. So is a fish plankton? No, right? Because fish, or we actually call that nectonic. So fish swim, and so they're kind of self-powered, and so they go where they want. Now we're used to thinking of plankton as being kind of like small. They don't actually have to be small. So for example, think about, has anyone ever seen those Portuguese man-o-war? Sometimes they show up on the beaches at the island. Okay, they have like the little sail, and they get blown around. And I mean, they just get blown around, right? Technically that's a type of plankton. So we don't think of maybe a lot of jellyfish. We don't think of them as plankton, but a lot of types of jellyfish are plankton. Why? They get carried by the currents and they get carried by the wind and all that stuff. Does that make sense? So the important thing is plankton, it gets carried by the currents and by they're not like self-powered in a way. They don't get to decide where they want to go. They just get carried along. They go with the flow. That's a good way to think of it. Okay, so that's plankton. And like I said, a lot of it's microscopic, but it doesn't have to be microscopic. So this is just some different types of plankton for you to think about. Number 13. So this shell this is called foraminifera. And I have some foraminifera up here on the microscope. So if you want to look after class, you can look at some of these things in the microscope slides. So that's foraminifera. These are organisms they're eukaryotic. They're actually a type of, they're not an animal, they're not a plant, they're actually a protist. So a lot of these things you'll find are actually protists, protozoans, or phyto, in that kingdom. Has anyone ever heard of the kingdoms of life? We'll have a lecture at the end that's more generally about marine life. We'll learn more detail about this, but big kingdoms of life are archaea and bacteria. Those are prokaryotes. And then we have protists. And then there's animals, plants, and fungus. Right? Those are the 6 kingdoms. So this kingdom is actually, these are the protists. What's a protist? Amoeba. Have you ever heard of amoeba, like brain-eating amoeba? That's a protist. You know what else is a protist? Malaria. Malaria is a protist. Paramecium, that's a protist. A lot of algae is a protist. And guess what? A lot of seaweed is also a protist. You might think seaweed is plants, but a lot of it's actually a type of algae. It's a protist. Okay, so a lot of these things are protists. Okay, here's an, oh, by the way, they make their shells out of something called calcium carbonate, and we're going to learn more about calcium carbonate as we move on through this seven lectures, so next time. Okay, and these are generally going to be important in warm waters. Okay, so you're supposed to put that down. So some of these are dominant in warm water, some of them are dominant in cooler water. Next one are coccolithophores. These are coccolithophores. These guys are very small. I want to point something out to you. This guy's 150. That bar right there is 150 micrometers. 150 micrometers. So a micrometer is a millionth of a meter. Okay. Generally, the smallest thing that you can see is maybe like. Probably this is right on the verge of what you could see with the naked eye. Usually you can see about 100 micrometers, okay? So probably the smallest thing you can see with your naked eye is maybe that scale bar, something like that. It depends on individuals. So you could see this just barely with the naked eye. And I have some of these guys, these foraminifera, and like you can hold it up to the light and you can see it, but it's hard to see. Okay, but with the microscope, you'll be able to see it real well. So that's foraminifera. Now, I'm going to show you the next one, are coccolithophores, okay? Now, these also produce their shells out of calcium carbonate. They're photosynthetic, but look at how small they are. Do you see that scale bar? That scale bar now is only 2. So these are like 100 times smaller than the foraminifera. So these are much smaller organisms. They're also protists. They're also photosynthetic. That means, right, I'm sure you all know what photosynthesis is, right? They're doing photosynthesis of the sun to produce energy. So these are the primary producers of the ocean. And by the way, you know what's kind of crazy? I keep talking about plankton. 80% of the carbon uptake of the whole Earth, where's it happening? It's these guys in the oceans. So, you know, a lot of people are worried about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Well, what's absorbing the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to you know, it's these things. This is doing 80% of the work. So they're very, very important, right? So there's the coccolithophores. Okay, now these are dominant also in warmer waters. Now, the next one, you actually have this in your sediment boxes. If you go to number 37, you have diatoms. And if you look at it, it's like a super, super fine-grained material. Do you see that? It's like finer grained than flour, like finer grained than bread flour. It's really fine-grained material. And what that is, that diatoms, what that is, it's called diatomaceous earth. Has anyone ever heard of diatomaceous earth? Okay, well, you can actually buy it like at Home Depot, places like that. It's very absorbent material. It's made 100% out of diatoms. It's made 100% out of this stuff. And again, it's just a type of algae that makes a shell. Very important though, I want to point something out to you all about diatoms you got to remember. Diatoms make their shells not out of calcium carbonate, they make them out of something called silica. So silicon, which is actually more, it's a harder material and it's more like rock-like. And these are dominant in cooler waters. Last group here are the dinoflagellates. photosynthetic, and they make their shells out of kind of out of organic material like keratin, kind of like what your fingernails or maybe like what your hair, something like that. You know, the keratin type material that your harder. It's not mineralized material. It's some kind of hard organic shell. I can't really explain it more than that because I don't really know much more than that. These are kind of deep biology things I don't know too much about. But dinoflagellates are very cool. I want to show you something here. Okay, this is just a video of. This is not the really cool one, but this is just a video of some kind of what a drop of seawater looks like. Okay. There's microscopic images of the life that's inside of the seawater that you don't see. So they're very busy.
Slide made from a single tiny drop in fresh water.
Sorry, I was just making sure this turned up all the way. There we go. Oh, whoops. Oh, gosh. I was just trying to pause it. Sorry. Oh, gosh. I got to do this again. Here we go. I'll put it back where it's supposed to be. I just want to point something out. Did you notice how she talked about zooplankton? So the algae, the green algae is doing photosynthesis. We call that phytoplankton. Phytoplankton. The rotifer that she pointed out, she called it zooplankton. You know, what do you see when you go to the zoo? Animals. Okay, so zooplankton, or that means like more animal-like. They're not actually animals, but they're more animal-like. Some of them are animals, though, but not all of the zooplankton is animals. I haven't actually looked at that website. I'm kind of interested in that now. I want to see this virtual microscope. So this is another cool thing about diatom or dinoflagellates. Has anyone ever seen things like this? No? Okay, they're luminescent waves. So they glow when the water becomes turbulent. So there's a lot of things, you can find a lot of things like this. They're like, it looks like magical. I'll show you. It's really weird. It looks like some kind of fantasy world, but it's real. So the dinoflagellates do bioluminescence, and I haven't heard. I remember somebody did a research paper actually last semester on why they do this, but I still don't. I can't remember exactly why they do it, but you'll see some. This is really crazy. So it's when the water is perturbed, that's when they give off their bioluminescence. So like if the dolphin is swimming through it, did anybody remember the part in Moana where the grandmother is like a whatever that thing is, big stink manta ray, and then she goes going flopping through the water, and then they make like all this. They actually showed this in Moana too. It has like all the bioluminescent glowing around her. So anyway, but this is real. It's not stuff. This is Newport, California. I never actually saw this, but it does happen in the California coast. I know it happens a lot in Costa Rica on the Pacific side. But anyway, I don't know. This goes on for another 2 minutes. If you want to watch this. And I thought this was just crazy too. This is a surfer in Newport. I think it's in Newport Beach, California, in Southern California. Riding. Oh, this is San Clemente. Riding, and look at it when he's like paddling out there. It's glowing, right? And then he rides these bioluminescent waves. It's pretty crazy. Crazy stuff, right? Probably like never knew that existed. So. Wow, look at that crashing on the rocks. That's neat. Okay. Ew, that was gross. I don't know why I put that slide up there. Yeah, it's like so beautiful, and then I go to like total gross. Okay, so what happens to the shells of microorganisms after they die? They sink, right? So all this plankton that's in the water, what happens to it after it dies, right? It just sinks to the bottom. It becomes that marine snow, quote. That's my email, sorry. And then, I don't know, and then I have this gross picture of octopuses eating a whale that died and sank to the bottom. So, and actually, that's the last slide of the lecture, so that's So anyway, yeah, that's all for today, and I'll see you on Wednesday. And just leave your lecture assignment, what, number 9? Is that what we're on? Lecture assignment? You could just leave that. I will come and collect it. And I'll see you next time. Ooh. place around here that you can use again. Let me turn this thing off here. Recording the whole conversation.
Yeah, so